Hello, welcome to another episode of Postcards from Antioch, a training, teaching, discipleship, mission podcast from Barton Church. And today, Oz and I are going to be having a chat about the Old Testament law and looking at it as a genre, how to think about it, if you've got to prepare a talk on an Old Testament passage from the law, how do you do that? So that's the kind of thing we'll be talking about today, I think, isn't it, Oz?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think if we can, we'll focus a bit on Exodus and maybe if we get time, a bit of Deuteronomy as well.
Yeah.
And then we get a bit of a case study towards the end of some of the principles we look at.
So looking at the law, obviously the law is, as a word, carries heavy tones, law, punishment, all those kind of things. Have you ever been stopped by the police, Oz, for breaking the law?
Oh, that sounds like quite a bad thing to happen. But yes, I have. It's one of those things, isn't it? When you drive, and certainly for me, if I realise I'm driving too fast, I'll kind of quickly check the mirrors and hope there's not a police car in sight. Unfortunately, once that did happen and I got pulled over when I was driving in South Africa, and I was a bit concerned because I thought, oh, I'm going to get asked to pay a steep fine or have to bribe my way out of prison or something. Anyway, I was driving quite fast, and faster than I probably should have been. And so I just chatted to the police officer, and he was really interested when I told him where I was staying. And then I thought, I'm just going to carry on trying to build a rapport. Yeah. And I talked about working for a church and a mission organization and going into schools and helping in the community. And he was so glad to hear that I was doing that he forgot that I'd been speeding and wished me well and set me on my way. So that's nice. Basically played the Christian card. Yeah, and it worked.
Well, that's, my opinion of you has gone down.
It's not necessarily
Did you keep like a dog collar in the glove box?
This was when I was a young 19-year-old. Yeah. So I wasn't even a holy pastor then.
Okay. I did get pulled over in Australia, funny enough, by the police for speeding. And the guy just basically let me off with a warning. I think he looked in, we were on our way on holiday, and there were roadworks, but I'd carried on following the speed limit. They basically was like, did you see the sign? And I think he looked in the back and saw 5 kids and thought, I'm just going to let this guy's got enough on his plate.
This poor guy.
Yeah. So he sent us off. So that's good. So a nice South African police officer, a nice Australian police officer.
Obviously, there's lots of nice British police officers out there as well. Yeah, and if you're listening and you're a police officer, then go easy on the person that you catch next.
Yeah. Unless they've done something really bad.
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
That
anyway,
is true.
But that's kind of the point. What is bad? What do you need to come down hard on, and what do you just say, okay, there's room for grace here? So speaking about the Old Testament law, doesn't sound like there's much grace in the Old Testament law, is there, Oz?
Well, there we go. That's a good opening thought, because when we hear the word law and Bible, it doesn't mean or make us necessarily want to dive into it and read it, because we'll soon discover, oh no, I'm not doing this, I've done that wrong, I fall short of a standard. And we can quite quickly build up an image of God as this lawgiver who's quite cross with us because we struggle to keep it.
Yeah.
And maybe on a kind of first reading of some of the Old Testament, we might go away with that concept for the people of Israel, how they failed, how they didn't kind of keep the law. And God's a bit like this police officer that basically tells them off and occasionally lets them off. But let's think, so the law books, and I think there's different ways of understanding that word law in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Torah is one,
which
is Hebrew for law.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Greek, I think it's nomos, which is the Greek word for it that we come across. But the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, are basically classed as the books of the law of Moses.
Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, is that the first place you jump to when you want to read the Bible?
Yeah, it's not the easiest place to start, is it? I mean, I remember someone saying, I want to read the Bible, and I thought I'd start in Genesis and read all the way through, which isn't a bad way to do it, but this particular person, a few of us said, no, you should probably start with a gospel or something like that, because you can get bogged down in numbers or something like that fairly early on.
So then one question might come to mind is, why would God, if he's revealing himself through words, through the Bible as we have it, why are there so many books, 5 big books, long books in the Old Testament, all about law? And I guess it's important to address that at the start and then see how that's unfolded as we dive into some details and look at some examples. But the law wasn't so much about making sure that the people kept to everything that God wanted them to keep to, but for them to know how to be God's people.
Yeah, okay.
How to relate to one another as a society, within a culture, and how to relate to God, to shed the ways of the Egyptian past as they had been kind of saved, rescued from Egypt via Moses and the Exodus, and that they wouldn't adopt the ways, the practices, the laws or lack of laws of the people of Canaan. So God gave them the law, which sounds quite burdensome, but actually is a way of relating to one another and to him as God's holy, distinct people.
Yeah, okay. So marking them out as being different from the nations around them.
Precisely. So law, if seen through that, rather than just the letter of the law, but a spirit of the law, the blessings of knowing how, and we've both got children, they kind of need some guidance and boundaries, don't they?
They need guidelines and boundaries. That's quite right. Yeah.
So maybe we can think of some of the laws at least as being more like boundaries, markers about how to relate to this God who is holy, powerful, has rescued them from Egypt through miraculous deliverance, but wants them to live in a way that's good for one another and to fulfill those Abrahamic promises.
Okay.
Yeah. But there are a few different ways the Bible talks about law. Do you know aware of any of, so when we come across law, what's it referring to? There's quite a few references in the New Testament and in the Old.
So well, I'm not sure. I think there is a distinction. Is there a distinction drawn between law with a capital L, kind of like the Torah, as you mentioned, those first 5 books of the library of the Bible, and then other things which are called law in the New Testament, but are more to do with things that have come about over the years of trying to figure out how to put into practice Torah.
Exactly, yes. And so that's really helpful to us, because when we read different parts of the Bible, we need to think, is it referring here to the first 5 books, the law of Moses? Is it referring to this whole Jewish tradition of commandments, laws that certain rabbis might interpret in certain ways? And, your laws, Jesus might say, you know, in a more informal sense.
Yeah.
He's not then knocking.
Meaning the things that have been added on, or how they've decided to apply the laws, the law in the Torah.
Precisely. So we've got laws, traditions, and all sorts of other things. There are just over 600 specific laws found in these 5 books that are commandments that the people of Israel needed to keep as evidence, in a way, of their loyalty to God, Yahweh God. Yeah. So we've got that in the plural sense, but then, as you say, the law with the capital L, talking about the Pentateuch, and typically in those first 5 books. And it's God's way of, almost as this, creating a covenant with his people. And that was actually quite normal for the cultures of the time, where a vassal, a kind of servant figure, and had this suzerain, this lord, overlord, saying, this is the relationship, the covenant that we're going to have. Here are the laws, keep them for your good and blessing. And if you don't, there'll be trouble. Yeah. It's quite a normal thing. So we've got that to understand about the general part of the Bible. So if we were to read Genesis through to Deuteronomy, would it just be law after law? Maybe you can explain. I mean, you're familiar with those books.
Yeah. it's not really just law after law. There are some stories thrown in there, sprinkled through there I mean, Genesis and Exodus really are mostly the story of God's people up to the point of how they received the law. And then Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, perhaps maybe a bit more law heavy, but there's still odd stories in there. I think particularly Deuteronomy, it's the last book of the Pentateuch, and that covers things like Moses' death and things like that.
Yeah. And so the laws are placed right in the middle of this historical narrative.
Yeah.
The patriarchs of Genesis, half of Exodus, until the Ten Commandments, when the people have reached Mount Sinai. And then you get all the explanations about how to build the tabernacle and all the laws as you've described. But I think that's helpful as well, to think that these early books in the Bible, they're setting the scene for the people of God. But law was given in the middle of a story of a movement of God and people.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's exactly what we get. We get lots of that. But how do we then, I guess the question is, how do we begin to apply something that's quite culturally specific, ancient, you could say? Why bother with it, really? We've got the New Testament. Why bother with law for a specific people in a specific time? Most of which Christians would say, well, Jesus has come. We don't need it. Have you ever had anyone ask you that? Don't know how you'd begin to think, and then I can maybe share some of the things that I've thought
I don't think I've ever had a discussion with anyone's asked me about that. I've thought about it myself. Like you do. I think you have to, really. You can't just. I don't think it's right, particularly as I am a Gentile believer, non-Jewish, to kind of lift the law given to Israel and think, well, how do I do all of these things? Like, because that's not what God's called me to. He's called, as you said, this was the covenant He gave to Israel, and so on. But I've not, I've not had that discussion with anyone. Maybe I'm about to.
Maybe you're about to. We're gonna think a bit about how we can rightly understand and apply and benefit from those early books in the Bible. I mean, we as preachers will preach on parts of them at times, and maybe not do a whole series on a whole book of the law, but there might be passages that we have preached on. And I guess a part of this is also encouraging people to get into those early books of the Bible, to understand the context for the New Testament and the rest of the Old Testament prophets and historical narratives. But I think what I want to say is that all of the Bible and those first 5 books, those laws included, are God's inspired word for us. Not direct commands for us to keep, but they are inspired, obviously highly relevant for the people at that time, but still applicable as we kind of figure out how today for us. So let's just jump. Maybe I can ask you to read Matthew 5:17 to 18. This is a bit of the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus's view of the laws and the Old Covenant. And that will help us to know what Jesus thinks, and then we'll go back and see actually what some of these passages in the law books say. Okay, so 17 and 18.
Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished.
Thanks. That's quite a key couple of verses there from Jesus, speaking about his being the fulfiller, but that doesn't mean that we can disregard. Instead, that there's relevance, they will be fulfilled and continue to be. So what we see is the 10 Commandments and the law of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, repeated by Jesus and the apostles in different books in the New Testament. But many of the other laws, they're not brought forward as direct commands for you and me as Gentiles We don't have a temple. We don't have a sacrificial system. Jesus was the Lamb of God who died. So we kind of know that as Christians, and maybe we've heard that in sermons, or we've figured that out ourselves. But I still think it's good for us just to understand what we do with chapter after chapter of awkward laws. Can we just skip over them? If you're doing like a Bible in the year, can you go Leviticus, skip?
Yeah.
I've been tempted to sometimes persevered and gone, right. And other times I've gone, oh, that's why it matters. So let's explore some of that together. So there's different types of laws. Some of them are civil and ritual. And we're not a part of the people of Israel at that time in that place. So understandably, we've said that we don't need to keep them. We haven't got a temple. We haven't got a sacrificial system that we're encouraged to implement. If we did, we might find like the RSPB or the human rights laws kind of knocking on our door. So probably just as well that we're not attempting to. But maybe we could just look at a few laws. So Leviticus 19, 9 to 14 sounds a bit like, maybe you can read that, sounds a bit like parts of the Ten Commandments, but it's more than that. And it's a bit of a do, don't, direct commands. So if you could read from verse 9 to 14 of Leviticus 19.
Yeah, Leviticus 19. From verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. Do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another. Do not swear falsely by my name and say profane the name of your Lord, of your God. I am the Lord. Do not defraud your neighbor or rob him. Do not hold back the wages of a hired man overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. Is that right?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So that just gives us a flavour of some of the laws, which are quite do or don't do this. But behind them, there are principles that we probably think, that's a good principle.
Yeah.
Did any stand out to you as you read them?
Well, so the first one about leaving, when you harvest, actually leaving stuff. I mean, we see that in practice in the book of Ruth, but also don't go over your vineyard the second time. So this principle of leaving stuff behind for those who are on the fringes of society. Yeah. And don't have their own vineyard or own fields to harvest.
Yeah, so it's a law that they've got to keep, but actually there's a great benefit for the poor, the disadvantaged. It makes us think of others, not just self, not maximum profit, but care for those that are disadvantaged. And then some of the other laws were quite understandably, well, that would make society better.
Yes, that's right.
So immediately we've talked just about a few laws that we think, well, we're not in that culture, we're not in that kind of society, we're not farmers maybe. Yeah. But how can we apply those principles helpfully? And what do they reveal about who God is? Yeah. And his heart for all, not just the wealthy, for justice, not just an obedient people that fall in line.
Yeah.
So I think there are a few things that we can take. But the law does set a standard by example. It says, look, how you live matters. And that is a part of being God's holy people. Not just because it's right to obey your Lord, but because there's a benefit for you and for others. And it's a way of maybe also fulfilling that promise to Abraham to be a blessing and a blessing to the nations, a light, distinct, different. So there's one example. Another one I've got here is in Deuteronomy 15, 12 to 17. And again, not a situation maybe we would find ourselves in, but maybe a principle that we can apply. And this is not so much a do or don't direct command. This is more a case-by-case law.
Okay, yeah.
That group of types of law, case by case, if this is your situation. So Deuteronomy 15 verse 12 says, if any of your people, so straight away, well, this isn't for everyone, Hebrew men or women, so specifically, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. This is why I give you this command today. So it's a command, it's a law. But it's not going to be something that everyone implements, because not everyone would have a servant or a slave. But if you do, there's a concept of freeing. Of blessing. So quite different to the maybe first sort of what a slave might be in our minds from history. And that you were slaves in Egypt and now God has freed you. So as God has freed you, think about how you imitate God. Which, again, how do we apply that? And when we read the New Testament, maybe we come across the concepts of households and families, but also servants or slaves, bond servants, and we can read that, and maybe not with the negative lens that we might jump to, but with the appropriate lens. Leviticus again. I don't know if you're still in Leviticus, chapter 11, verse 7.
Return to Leviticus. Chapter 11, did you say?
Yeah, verse 7. So we've jumped from some direct commands to some case by case, if this is your circumstance, and now we'll look at a food law.
Okay.
Do you like bacon?
I do, yeah. Bacon makes everything better.
A good old BLT. Hard to beat.
Well, just get rid of the L and the T.
Right.
No, I do like lettuce, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. If you can read 11 verse 7 for us of Leviticus.
11:7. And the pig, though it has a split hoof completely divided, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you.
Right. So I think this is in a chapter of lots of food laws.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So
about what food, clean and unclean food. Yeah.
So we don't think of it in those terms, do we? Well, we'll probably wash the food that we eat.
Right. Yeah.
In some occasions.
Yes.
Maybe a dodgy lettuce, give it a rinse. But typically, we don't have clean and unclean classifications.
No.
Kind of eat what you want as long as it's not bad for you. And even then we might do it.
Yeah.
But God decided to say, this is on the menu, this is off the menu. And pork is one of those, it's off the menu.
Yeah.
And we might think, why did God do that? What was the sense, the purpose? And it's probably true that different theologians and dietitians have speculated.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if do you know why?
I remember hearing someone say, well, pork is not very healthy. So it's of a health benefit. God gave this law not because he just arbitrarily picked the pigs, but because he was thinking, oh, this is good for my people's health. But I mean, I don't know if that's valid or not.
I think that's one of the thoughts. I've heard a few others as I was preparing this one. It would be foolish in an agrarian context of a desert or Canaan to try and kind of focus your energy on herds of pigs,
right.
better flocks of lambs and goats which cope in those environments. The other that actually there's a greater risk of disease and hygiene issues when. So, there are all these kind of arguments.
Yeah.
On one level, God said, so therefore do it. But it seems actually even beneath that, there's some wisdom in terms of hygiene, diet, health, and the context you're in that might mean it's wise not to. And that, incidentally, lamb seems to be the least sort of allergy type meat. And that was typically the prime meat that they ate.
Yes. Yeah.
So God cares about our body.
Yeah.
Health could be one of the things.
Yeah.
But food laws, that's just one example. And then the whole system changes, doesn't it, when we get to Acts and Peter sees this vision. Yeah. And all food's back on the menu for the Gentile, at least. Yeah. And arguably for Jews, although maybe not. But yeah, there's a there's a shift. It's less about what you put in that's unclean and more about what comes out of the heart that's unclean.
Yeah.
So food laws. So for then, there's a bunch of then. And then there's a load of laws about the shedding of blood and the sacrificial system, and the consequence of sin, death penalty in some instances, adultery, for example, how to slaughter a bull, what to do with the blood, how to sprinkle it over the altar, how to deal with sin of sort of unintentional sin, intentional sin. We're not going to read all of those, but what I gather, I'd expect many people that are probably listening to this know that Jesus was one sacrifice once for all. And therefore we don't, and not only do we not have a temple and a system, but his blood was shed for us, and we put faith in his sacrifice as the ultimate substitute and atoning sacrifice. So loads of laws, loads of other things that we could go down, like why you shouldn't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. There's the other classic that comes out.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've got a great answer for that one. No?
No. Well, I've heard it's to do with some sort of pagan ritual, sort of idol worship. But again, I wonder if that's just sort of speculation or whether there's hard
evidence for ritual cult practices of the surrounding nations, and therefore you're different. These symbolic magic acts aren't going to be what we're about. Probably, possibly, who knows? Either way, there are lots of these ones. And I mean, I remember listening to the radio once, and a friend of mine, he had said he was on the radio. He was a theology student at Durham, and he was asked that specific question by some sort of radio presenter. So you're a Christian. Well, what about the Old Testament? It's pointless, irrelevant. Why, is this law? And this was the specific law that was quoted by the DJ guy and the radio guy. And the answer was, as we've discussed. But the emphasis was for that time, for those people to keep honoring God through how they lived, rather than us figuring out what it means to do.
Yeah.
So loads of different laws. So if you're listening, or if we're preparing a sermon, if we're looking at leading a Bible study, how do we make the most of these bits of the Bible?
Yeah.
We're probably not going to jump to some of these passages immediately.
No.
But it would be foolish to just avoid them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah? They're God's word. So context, I think, keeping in mind the promises of Abraham and how they're fulfilled through the nation of Israel, being a witness, a holy blessing. Observation, understanding its historical narrative mixed with law, and knowing how to apply now that Christ has come and we have the Holy Spirit, we don't have a temple, we don't have the need for a sacrificial system, is really important. And then applying, actually getting to the application, I think one of the main things to bear in mind is through the light of the coming Saviour Jesus, the ultimate lawgiver of the Holy Spirit, really, impressing the law upon our hearts so that we can know God's ways and live in line with his will. All those kind of principles, I think, are principles we can take and discover more about who God is. I mean, who would you say, how does God reveal himself, his character, through books like Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy? Are there characteristics of God you think come out?
Well, I think we've touched on it. Like some of the laws we looked at highlighted concern for justice, which indicates that God has a heart for justice. So I think there's those kind of things, love for the community, looking after others, that these are things that are important to God. As you say, not just pursuit of, profit for profit's sake and exploitation, but actually, sort of living in harmony with others around you and with the world around you. But at the same time, God is passionate for his people to avoid being drawn into the religions of the nations around them. And because he knows that will lead them into practices that are against his character and not what his heart is for.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's really helpful. So God's justice and being distinct, holiness of God. Actually, by reading these things, we see in a different way through this biblical genre characteristics of God to the fore and the implications of us and how we do things even when we don't fully understand them, maybe, because of who God is and the fact that it's going to be good for others. Great. So we're just going to finish this episode now with a little look at Exodus and maybe very briefly Deuteronomy. Exodus is the second book of the Bible. The first half, as you've said, is largely narrative, but then we get the Ten Commandments and I think chapter 19. And then it feels like a book of the law with lots of instructions, lots of details. And then so just as we think about these books, I think the structure of books are really important to understand, and they help us to then interpret them and apply them. So one way of understanding Exodus is to see, not just to sort of dive into the odd verse here or there, but to step back and see the big picture of the book and how the first maybe 13 chapters, it's Israel in Egypt and God is revealed as Savior. And then the second sort of chunk, chapter 13 to 24, Israel's at Sinai. The Exodus has happened, and we see God as the companion, the law-giving companion. He's with his people. He's revealing himself in a way that he hadn't had through miraculous signs and wonders, but now it does through law. And then the last chapters, 24 to 40, Israel are at Sinai, but they're around the tabernacle that's being made or being explained. And God is dwelling with his people. So as we think about these kind of themes, if we're then in a particular chapter in Exodus, we can think, right, well, this is the kind of big picture of what God is revealing himself as. How does this verse chapter relate to that larger revelation of God? So, and then within Exodus, we've got lots of themes like covenant and God's name in chapter 3 being revealed, the Lamb of God, God's fiery holiness, and then specifically the law in chapter 19-20, the tabernacle. So there's loads of different themes that we can look at, as well as the specific kind of being overwhelmed maybe by what on earth. Why do I need to read about ephods and priests? Well, maybe that's relevant. So we'll just look at one comparison, and maybe we'll do, if you could read Exodus 29, verse 42 to 46.
Exodus 29, 42 to 46.
Yeah, thank you. And then I'll get another reference ready.
42. So Exodus 29, verse 42. For the generations to come, this burnt offering is to be made regularly at the entrance to the tent of meeting before the Lord. There I will meet you and speak to you. There also I will meet with the Israelites, and the place will be consecrated by my glory. So I will consecrate the tent of meeting and the altar, and will consecrate Aaron and his sons to serve me as priests. Aaron. Then I will dwell among the Israelites and be their God. They will know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of Egypt, so that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God.
Thanks. So we've got there some law-related language with the tabernacle, with sacrifices, but in those last few verses, we'd see that there's a focus on God dwelling with his people, being with them, close, near. This is a God that is not distant, removed. He's with them. And then if we think of John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, dwelt, tabernacled, lived. And then in Revelation 21, pretty much the last chapter of the Bible, verse 3, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. So what you've just read, what Jesus embodied, what the end of the Bible is about, is basically God being with his people, close.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just one example from Exodus, and there are others can help us see, wow, this is quite exciting. This is relationship.
Yes.
Not rules. Yeah. This is off the back of rescue. And suddenly this idea of law being about God being a policeman that's always upset with us is probably not the best analogy. In fact, it's heretical. It's wrong.
Yeah.
God is wanting to be with him, with his people, like a father wants to be with his children. So that's Exodus. And very briefly, Deuteronomy, we'll just touch on, I think. We've got a few minutes. So this is the conclusion of the Pentateuch. And somebody said that, I think it might have been Chris Wright, the heartbeat of the Old Testament is found in Deuteronomy. So if you want to get a taste of the Old Testament, read Deuteronomy, and it's like the beating heart. It means second law or copy of the law, and Moses basically preaches a sermon. We've got a prologue, his first speech, a second, and then a third speech, and then the sort of farewell and his departure. So it's Moses going, I've traveled with you for 40 years. You've come out of Egypt. This is all that's happened. And it's his big exhortation. It's like an inspirational, motivational message. Keep going, choose life, choose God, be obedient, and blessings will come. And so it's got a different flavor to Exodus. It's got a different flavor to Leviticus, but it's full of law, and it is built around that ancient Near Eastern covenant form that we've referred to at the beginning. So with that kind of preamble, prologue, general stipulations, detailed ones, and then the blessings and curses that will come. And again, it's full of themes that are really relevant. And so I wonder, you mentioned at the start, and well, maybe this will be a good finishing point, about how it can feel a bit graceless, the Old Testament law.
Yeah.
Is there grace? Where's grace in books like Deuteronomy? And, should we really persevere with them? What kind of things maybe jump to mind when you think about grace in Deuteronomy? Anything particularly?
Nothing specifically. I don't know the book well enough, I think, but I'm sure there's plenty of hints of grace, if not outright grace, in some of these things that Moses speaks about.
Yeah, and I think just like the general overall narrative is you've been saved, and the promise of the promised land is coming. You're about to enter it under Joshua. So saved to enjoy the dwelling of God with you, to fulfill the promises, rescued by grace.
Yeah.
Not because you're great, not because you're mighty or in number, but because I love you, like my firstborn child, and so come and enjoy it. But that comes with a committed relationship of faithfulness, of loving loyalty and obedience. And actually, what's our relationship with God based on? It's based on our rescue, on God's grace to us. But it comes with a, look, if you're going to, then be faithful. Follow my commands. Jesus says, teaching disciples to obey all that I've said. And if we don't, there's grace. And there was. And actually the story of the whole Old Testament is one of God's people failing, and yet God in his grace and patience giving them another go, another chance, forgiving them. And yet in the end, they were judged. But even then, a remnant survived. And in Jesus, we know that the fulfillment came as amidst our failure to keep the law, as we read in like Romans 3, no one is righteous, not even one. But in Jesus, while we were still sinners, Christ died for the ungodly, that we could become children of God. And Deuteronomy, kind of, we see echoes of that through the book. And so, yeah, just an encouragement. Let's not overlook the law books, be it Exodus and that famous story, being rescued from Egypt, the Ten Commandments, or Deuteronomy might on the surface feel like repetition, but actually we see grace at the heart of it. We see God's faithfulness. We see issues of, we've mentioned justice, poverty, debt, homelessness, social, hygiene, ethics, but all of them we can think about applying in our lives today, and through the light of who God reveals himself to be. So maybe if you want to find out more, just take a deep dive into Deuteronomy. People, if you're listening, go for it. I think it's an amazing book that wraps up the Pentateuch, the law books, and we see grace at the heart of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the wonderful thing about where we are now is that there's always the internet. There's all kinds of resources out there to help you understand some of the trickier passages. If you're struggling with sort of asking that question, well, what's the principle behind this, or anything like that. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Oz. I'm sure that's really helpful. It's very, very helpful advice there for people who are perhaps struggling to just read it, let alone having to prepare to speak about it or anything like that.
Well, so no problem. Good
thank
fun.
you. Yeah. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Postcards from Antioch.